They laughed when I fell down the stairs. Not out of malice, no. Their laughter was lighter, careless, the kind that comes when people think they're witnessing something harmless. But I remember the sound of it, the sharp ripple cutting through the air, far better than I remember the pain. Strange, isn't it? How humiliation leaves a clearer imprint than bruises. At 69, you get used to many things: joints that warn you of rain, neighbors who forget your name, children who speak to you with the tone people reserve for stubborn pets. But I didn't expect laughter, not from my own blood. I had come because my daughter insisted it would be good for me to get out of the house. Her words carried the same tone they always did, the one that pretended to be concern, but never reached her eyes. Still, I walked those 5 steps up to the porch, holding the railing out of habit more than need. The wood felt solid under my hand, old, worn, familiar. I'd climbed those stairs countless times. I trusted them. It happened between one breath and the next. A cracking sound, small but sharp. The railing gave way under my weight, and the world tilted. There was no time to catch myself. My body met the steps with a dull, heavy rhythm: shoulder, hip, elbow, then the cold slap of earth. For a moment, I lay there, stunned, staring at the underside of the porch as if it were the sky. "Mom, oh my God, did you see that?" My daughter's voice broke first, and then her husband's laughter followed like an echo behind her. Not cruel, not quite. Just detached. As if I were watching myself fall in some home video they'd play years later at a family dinner. I tried to push up on my palms, but my left arm trembled uselessly. Sharp pain ran up my wrist. Someone should have rushed to me then. Someone should have knelt beside me, touched my shoulder, spoken softly. But they stood where they were, amused, uncertain, whispering to each other like I couldn't hear them. "She just slipped," my son-in-law said. "She does that." As if my whole life had been one long, clumsy accident. I managed to sit up. The world swayed, but I kept my voice steady. Pride does that. It pulls you upright even when your bones protest. "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as if parts of the world had loosened their grip. My daughter finally stepped forward, her smile tight, embarrassed. Not for me, but for the scene I was making. "Mom, you scared us," she said, but her tone betrayed annoyance more than worry. "You really need to watch where you're going." I didn't answer. I was staring at the railing. A long, clean split ran through the wood. Too clean, too fresh. I knew that porch like the back of my arthritic hand. That break hadn't been there yesterday. My daughter didn't notice my silence. She busied herself brushing imaginary dust from my sleeve, hurrying me inside, eager to restore the evening to whatever shape she'd planned. I let her fuss, because fighting would have taken more strength than I had at that moment. Inside, the lights were warm, the table set, the air thick with the smell of roasted chicken. It should have felt comforting. Instead, everything looked faintly unreal, as if I'd walked into a stranger's house wearing my own skin. Only later, when they were laughing again at some joke I didn't hear, did I step into the hallway alone. My wrist throbbed. My hip ached. But what unsettled me wasn't the pain. It was the memory of that sharp crack, the fresh split in the wood, and the feeling that something had been waiting for me the moment I put my hand on that railing. I stood there, breathing slowly, letting the truth take its shape. It wasn't an accident. And the way they laughed, so easily, so quickly, told me more than they ever intended to say. Morning arrived with the kind of silence that feels unfamiliar, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I woke before the sun, my body stiff from the fall, my wrist throbbing with a deep, pulsing ache. When you're my age, pain has a way of settling in quickly, like an old tenant reclaiming its room. I lay there for a moment, letting the ceiling come into focus, feeling the weight of the previous evening settle over me more heavily than the bruises. Getting out of bed was an exercise in patience. Every movement reminded me of the stairs, of the cracked wood, of the laughter. I held onto the doorframe, steadying myself as I walked to the kitchen. The house felt different today. Not unsafe, but newly sharp, as if all its edges had been exposed overnight. Perhaps it was just me who had changed, seeing things more clearly than I had allowed myself to yesterday. I made tea, though my hands shook so badly that half the water sloshed outside the cup. I stood at the counter, breathing slowly, waiting for the trembling to ease. When it finally did, I walked to the porch window, letting the early light stretch across the floor. The railing was visible from where I stood. Even at a distance, the split in the wood looked wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate. Not the fraying kind of break you get from age and weather. This one looked young, precise. The memory of that sharp crack replayed itself in my mind, clearer than anything else from the evening. I'd lived in this house for 43 years, long enough to know every weakness in its bones. That railing hadn't been loose, and the thought that someone might have interfered with it felt too large to accept all at once. So instead, I let the suspicion sit quietly inside me, like a visitor I wasn't ready to speak to yet. Around 9, my daughter called. Her voice came through the phone, bright, cheerful, too rehearsed. "Morning, Mom. Feeling any better?" she asked. I heard dishes in the background, the hum of her comfortable kitchen, the clatter of a life untouched by last night. "I'm sore," I answered truthfully. "My wrist is swollen." "Well, that's what happens when you don't hold the railing properly. You should have been more careful." I looked again at the wood outside. She hadn't even seen the break. Or maybe she had and chose to ignore it. My daughter has always been selective with her vision. "You left in a hurry," she added. "We didn't get to finish dinner." "I was in pain," I said softly. "Yes, but you made it more dramatic than it needed to be." "Honestly, Mom, you're too sensitive lately." That stung more deeply than she understood. I swallowed, letting her words pass through me like a cold wind. Is Mark home?" I asked, meaning her husband. A pause. Why? I thought he might have noticed something about the railing. Another pause. Longer this time. Brittle. "Nothing was wrong with it," she said sharply. "You slipped. That's all." Her defensiveness settled over me like dust, fine and revealing. "I should probably get my wrist checked," I said after a moment. "Do what you need to do," she replied, her tone cooling. "Just don't worry us with your ideas. You tend to overthink things." I thanked her and hung up. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. I stood by the window again, staring at the damage. Overthinking. That's what she calls it when I notice things she wants left alone. I put on a sweater and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind that wakes your lungs. The railing looked even worse up close. The break was not from rot. No mildew, no splintering along the grain. The wood had been cut, cleanly, recently, like someone had taken a tool to it. I touched the edge lightly. It was smooth. My heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. I had spent decades patching up small household things, adjusting shelves, tightening bolts, fixing drawers. My husband had been the kind of man who loved building but hated maintaining, so I learned to take tools into my own hands. I knew what natural aging looked like, and this was not it. I walked back inside slowly, thinking of what might have been last night had I hit my head differently, had I landed wrong, had I been just a little older, a little frailer. The thought left a coldness beneath my ribs. Just before noon, I opened the drawer where I keep important papers. The envelope that held my property documents was there, but thinner than before. I sifted through the contents once, twice. 2 sheets were missing. Not misplaced. Gone. I sat down as a realization settled into place, quiet and unmistakable. Someone had been on my porch before I arrived. Someone had been in my home afterward. I pressed my swollen wrist against my chest, breathing slowly. At my age, people assume you don't notice things. They assume you forget. They assume wrong. Today, the truth was sharper than the pain. Something wasn't right, and someone knew it long before I did. The clinic always smells of disinfectant and old coffee, a mixture that reminds me of the years I spent taking my husband to appointments. I sat in the waiting room with my wrist pressed against my coat, trying not to wince each time the pain shifted. A mother with a toddler glanced at me with polite concern, but no one said anything. People rarely speak to older women unless they need to. When the nurse finally called my name, I followed her slowly down the hallway. My steps were steady, but every movement carried yesterday's fall inside it. She led me into a small examination room, took my blood pressure, asked if I'd had any dizziness. I told her no. Dizziness is temporary. What I felt was something else, an unease that filled the spaces between thoughts. The doctor, a younger man with tired eyes, came in a few minutes later. "Ms. Cole, let's take a look." He gently rotated my wrist, his touch careful but clinical. I felt the pain shoot up my arm and tightened my jaw. He murmured. "Did you land directly on this hand?" "I fell backward," I said, "off a porch staircase. The railing broke." He looked up at me. Broke how? The question surprised me. Most people I'd spoken to so far had simply assumed I'd tripped. "It split," I answered, cleanly, as if it had been cut. He raised an eyebrow, not mocking, just attentive. "May I see a photo?" I didn't take one. I hesitated. "But I can describe it. The wood was smooth at the break, not weathered." "That doesn't sound like natural deterioration," he said quietly, "especially on a load-bearing railing." He scribbled something in my chart, then set the pen down. "You didn't hit your head, correct?" "No," I answered, though the memory of the fall replayed vividly behind my eyes. "Well, your wrist is moderately sprained. Nothing broken?" Relief washed through me, even though the pain would last for weeks. He wrapped it carefully in a supportive bandage. "I'll also note the details about the railing, just in case." "In case of what?" I asked softly. He hesitated, choosing his words with a kind of respect I hadn't heard from my own family in years. "In case something about your fall wasn't accidental." My breath caught, not because his words were new, but because someone else finally said them aloud. Someone who had no reason to doubt me. "I don't want to alarm you," he continued, "but if the structural damage was recent and deliberate, it should be documented. You may want to have someone inspect it." "Someone like the police?" I asked, though I wasn't ready to hear the answer. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. When I left the clinic, the wind stung my cheeks. I stood by the curb, letting the air clear my head. It's strange how quickly a suspicion can shift into a truth once spoken. Yesterday, the split railing felt like a whisper I could ignore. Today, it felt like a presence walking beside me. The bus took longer than usual. I watched the town through the window, the grocery store where I used to shop weekly with my daughter, the library where I spent my career, the hardware shop where my husband bought nails he never used. Life moved with an indifference that steadied me. The world does not slow for the discomfort of an old woman. When I reached my stop, I walked home more slowly than I had planned. The bandage around my wrist throbbed with every step, but pain wasn't what made my heart beat heavier. It was the memory of my daughter's voice from that morning, dismissive, impatient, unwilling to see anything that might inconvenience her. And Mark. Mark hadn't spoken to me at all since the fall. He'd hovered near the porch afterward, glancing at the railing with something that looked too much like calculation. I remembered that moment now with a clarity that unsettled me. As I approached my house, I paused at the bottom of the steps. The railing waited there, broken, quiet, holding its secrets. I crouched slowly, ignoring the protest of my hip, and examined the split again. Yesterday, I doubted my own instincts. Today, I didn't. A cut like that doesn't happen on its own. I stood up carefully, holding the good railing as I climbed onto the porch. Inside, the house swallowed me with its familiar silence, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt like a place where someone had been when they shouldn't have. The missing documents, the clean edge of the break, the way they laughed, the way they looked away. These pieces were beginning to form a shape. Not a full picture yet, just an outline, but outlines are enough. They show you where danger lies. I sat down at the kitchen table and folded my bandaged hand into my lap, breathing slowly. I wasn't ready to make accusations. Not yet. But I knew what I'd do next. Before the day ended, someone else would hear my story. Someone who couldn't laugh it away. The officers arrived just after 3 in the afternoon. I heard the knock while I was sitting at the kitchen table, my good hand around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The sound startled me, not because it was loud, but because it felt so deliberate, as if the day itself had been waiting for this moment to unfold. 2 officers stood on my porch when I opened the door. A young woman with sharp, observant eyes, and an older man whose expression carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen more than he wished to remember. They introduced themselves politely. Their presence softened something inside me, though my pulse still trembled beneath my skin. "Ms. Cole, we received a report about a fall on this property," the woman said. "We'd like to ask you a few questions." A report? That meant someone other than me had reached out. A neighbor, perhaps. Someone who'd heard the commotion. Or maybe the clinic had passed on information. Regardless, I stepped aside and let them in. The house felt almost embarrassed, the way it held the light uncertainly, as though it, too, knew something had shifted. We sat at the table. The officers waited, patient and respectful, as if letting me find the right place inside myself to begin. "I fell yesterday evening," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were not. Off the porch stairs, the railing gave way. The younger officer leaned forward slightly. "Can you describe exactly what happened?" I told them. Not dramatically, not with embellishment. Those things don't suit a woman of my age. Just the truth, carefully laid out. The sound of the crack, the fall, the laughter, my daughter's dismissive tone. the unnatural split in the wood. When I finished, the room felt as still as the moment before a storm breaks. The older officer nodded. "May we take a look at the railing?" "Of course." I led them outside, holding the good railing as I stepped down slowly. They examined the broken one with a seriousness that made my throat tighten. The younger woman ran her fingers over the cut surface exactly as I had done that morning. When she looked up at her partner, her expression told me I hadn't been imagining anything. "This cut is clean," she said. "Too clean for natural wear." "And recent," the older officer added. "There's no discoloration, no weathering." I felt a tremor travel through my body, not fear exactly, but recognition. A truth settling into its rightful place. "When was the last time you saw this intact?" he asked. "Yesterday morning," I answered. "I clean the porch every few days. I would have noticed." The woman nodded. "Have there been any signs of forced entry into your home? Missing items?" My heart tightened. "Some papers. From a folder I keep in my desk. Property documents. Nothing else appears disturbed." "What kind of documents?" she asked gently. "My deed, insurance papers, a few other things." Their eyes met again. Not dramatically, not in alarm, but with the quiet professionalism of people who recognize a pattern forming. "Ms. Cole," the older officer said, "is there anyone who might want access to these documents, or who might benefit from having them?" For a moment, the names inside my mind felt heavy, too heavy to speak aloud. There is a certain shame in admitting that harm might come from those closest to you. It goes against the instinct of motherhood, which is to protect at all costs, even when the cost is yourself. "My daughter and her husband were here yesterday," I said finally. "Before the fall. After, too." The officers didn't rush me. The younger woman tilted her head slightly, encouraging but patient. "Do you believe they might have taken the papers?" Believe. The word felt too strong. But suspect. Yes, I suspected. I suspected a great many things now. "I don't want to accuse anyone without reason," I said quietly. "But the timing is troubling." "We understand," the older officer said. "And you're not accusing anyone. You're providing information." He straightened and walked a few steps along the porch, taking photos, documenting everything with meticulous care. The younger officer remained beside me. "Ms. Cole," she said gently, "falls like this, especially involving structural damage, are taken seriously. We'll file a report, and we may need to speak with your family." My chest tightened. Not with fear for myself, but with the memory of their laughter. The casual cruelty wrapped in amusement. I wondered what they would say when asked to explain themselves. Whether they would lie easily. Whether they would laugh again. "I want the truth," I said finally. It came out softer than I intended, but no less firm. "Whatever it is." "You'll have it," she replied. They walked down the steps a moment later, promised to update me soon, then disappeared into the late afternoon. The street swallowed them quietly, leaving me alone on the porch. I touched the broken railing once more. The wood felt cold beneath my fingertips, as if holding on to its own memory of what had happened. Inside the house, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It carried a different weight. It carried the beginning of something larger than the fall, larger than the pain, larger even than the humiliation. It carried the shape of an investigation. There are moments in life when the present becomes so sharp, so demanding, that it pulls the past up with it, the way a tide drags forgotten shells onto the shore. That evening, after the officers left, the house felt heavier than before, not because of fear, but because their questions lingered in the air, stirring things I'd kept tucked away for years. I sat in my old armchair, my wrist throbbing beneath its bandage, and let the quiet settle over me. It's strange how memories don't arrive in order. They come instead in sensations. The weight of a child's head on your shoulder, the sharpness of a slammed door, the sound of laughter that isn't meant kindly. I closed my eyes and let the fragments pull together, not as a flashback. Those belong to novels and dramatic retellings, but as a feeling, a long thread running through my life. I thought of my daughter, Lorna, when she was still small enough to reach for my hand without thinking. Back then, she spoke softly, always trying to please. Her eyes were gentler. There was a warmth to her that hadn't yet learned to measure affection in terms of convenience. But children grow, and the world teaches them things you never would. By the time she reached her 20s, that softness had hardened into something brisk, impatient. She loved me, I know she did, but it became a quiet kind of love, conditional, trimmed at the edges, careful not to interfere with her ambitions. And then came Mark. I never disliked him, not at first. He had a certain charm, though it was the kind that fades quickly once you see how thin it lies on him. He always called me ma'am, even after I asked him to use my name. That tiny distance, that tiny barrier. It was the first sign. But you ignore such things when you want your child to be happy. I learned, slowly, painfully, that Mark's charm was for everyone except the people he didn't need. Over the years, I noticed how Lorna changed around him, how she adopted his tone, how she spoke to me with the same clipped politeness he used, as if motherhood were something I'd once performed adequately, but had since retired from. Birthdays became obligations. Holidays became hurried. My presence seemed to shrink in their lives, not with cruelty, but with neglect, which is a softer thing, but cuts just as deeply. Some nights I would sit in this same chair, listening to the wind press against the windows, and wonder when I had become someone they guided rather than greeted, someone they corrected rather than listened to, someone they expected to understand without ever being understood in return. I'm not naive. I know that aging shifts the balance of things. Children step forward, parents step back. But stepping back shouldn't mean vanishing. And yet, that is what I slowly became in their home. A shadow at the doorway, convenient to invite when they needed admiration, inconvenient when they needed patience. It wasn't until last year that I began to feel the change in a sharper way. Little comments, dropped lightly but with intention. Mom, you shouldn't handle finances alone anymore. It's not safe for you to keep important papers in the house. You worry too much about things that don't matter. Remarks that landed like feathers but gathered like stones. They made me doubt my own mind. Doubt is a cruel companion. It creeps in quietly and rearranges the furniture inside your thoughts. But last night's fall, that laughter, that was something else. There was no doubt in that moment. It wasn't the fall that hurt me the most. It was how easily they dismissed it, how quickly they stepped back, folded their arms, let amusement take the place of concern. When people show you what you mean to them, you should pay attention. I hadn't, not fully. I always made excuses for them: busy lives, work stress, the rapid years that pull families apart without a single explosion. But excuses wear thin when you're lying at the bottom of a staircase, listening to your own daughter tell you to be more careful. Now, sitting in the dim yellow light of the living room, I felt the weight of all the small indignities I'd tolerated over the years. Not out of weakness, but because love persuades you to accept less than you deserve, believing it is temporary, believing it will be repaid in some unspoken way. But love should not make a fool of you. And there is a quiet humiliation in realizing how far you've bent yourself to keep peace in a family that no longer sees you clearly. My tea had gone cold again. I held the mug anyway, letting the warmth at the bottom soothe the ache in my hand. Outside, the porch creaked in the evening breeze, a soft, usual sound. But tonight it frightened me, because I knew now that wood doesn't split itself and documents don't disappear on their own. And laughter. Laughter says everything people don't dare voice. I sat there a long time, breathing slowly, letting each truth settle into place. The investigation had begun, but something else had begun too. Something inside me. A quiet, steady resolve I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. And once a woman my age sees things clearly, there is no unseeing them. The next morning began with a phone call. I didn't want to answer. Unknown number. Normally, I let such things ring into silence, but after the officer's visit, every unexpected sound carried a certain weight. I picked up slowly, bracing myself. "Ms. Cole?" a man asked. His voice was formal, practiced. "This is Daniel Hart from Midland Savings Bank. We're calling to verify an online request we received yesterday evening. Are you available to confirm some details?" A request. I felt a small tightening in my chest. What kind of request? "A password reset and new device authorization," he said. "It appears someone tried to access your accounts remotely. Before we proceed, we need to confirm that this was you." "It wasn't," I said quietly. There was a pause on his end, the kind people make when they're rearranging their tone. "Then, I'm afraid someone attempted to enter your account with personal identifying information." I sat down at the kitchen table, the phone pressed to my ear, my bandaged wrist throbbing against the wood. "What information?" I asked. "Your address, date of birth, partial social security number, and the answer to one of your security questions." My breath slowed. "Which question?" "Your daughter's middle name." I closed my eyes. Lorna's middle name wasn't something strangers would know. "Ms. Cole, we've already blocked further attempts," he continued gently, "but it would be wise to change all logins. And, may I ask, has anyone else recently had access to your home?" His question settled into the room like dust, visible in the morning light. I looked toward my desk drawer, the thin folder, the missing documents. "Yes," I said. "My daughter and her husband were here." Another pause. "I understand. If you'd like, we can set up additional protections that require in-person verification." "Yes," I answered. "Please do that." When I hung up, the house felt different again, not just unsettled, invaded. I walked into the living room slowly, as if the walls themselves might offer answers. They didn't. They only reflected back the truth I'd tried not to see for too long. Someone had wanted my accounts. Someone had wanted my documents. Someone had known the exact question a bank would ask. And still, I found myself resisting the simplest explanation. You don't spend decades loving a child only to believe easily that they could put a hand to harm you, even if the harm is quiet, administrative, hidden behind digital buttons instead of violence. I made tea, though my hands trembled again. The steam fogged my glasses. I let it blur the world for a moment. When I finally sat down with the mug, I tried to think rationally, step by step, the way I'd once taught students in the library to outline their research. Someone was in my house. They opened my drawer. They removed specific papers. They tried to access my accounts, and the railing was cut. Each fact alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed something that felt like a cold hand pressing against my spine. Around noon, I called the officers who had visited yesterday. I told them about the bank call, the missing papers, the security question. They listened carefully. The woman, Officer Reyes, asked me to come to the station later in the week to give a formal statement about the financial aspect. That kind of activity, she said, often connects to attempts to claim property or redirect assets. We take it seriously. I thanked her, though the words felt thin. Seriousness wouldn't soften the truth, nor would it change what was already happening. After the call, I stayed seated for a long while. I watched the light move slowly across the floor, listened to the wind brushing the porch. I remembered how Lorna used to rest her head on my shoulder when she was tired. How she once brought me a drawing of our house and said, "This is where you'll always live, Mommy." A promise made by a child, unaware of the weight those words might carry one day. I touched the bandage on my wrist. It pulsed, sore and stubborn, like a reminder that my body still knew how to warn me even when my heart hesitated. They laughed when I fell. They looked away when I stood. But the truth wasn't looking away anymore. And neither was I. I wasn't planning to visit an attorney. Women like me don't grow up imagining we'll ever need one. Not for family matters, at least. Attorneys are for complicated estates, broken contracts, people who have something to fight over. But that morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the swollen shape of my wrist, I realized I was already in a fight. Not one I chose, but one that had chosen me the moment the railing cracked. The law office was only a few blocks from the library where I once worked. Walking there felt strange, like retracing steps from a life that had slipped quietly behind me. The receptionist greeted me with polite warmth, the kind reserved for elderly clients who aren't expected to cause trouble. I sat in a soft chair, listening to the faint hum of printers and distant conversation. When Mr. Alden finally came out to meet me, I felt myself straighten instinctively. He was in his 60s. Older, but not old enough to understand what it feels like to be treated as past one's use. Still, his eyes softened when he saw my bandaged wrist. "Ms. Cole," he said, shaking my good hand. "Come in. Please sit. What can I help you with?" It took me a moment to speak. Not because I lacked words, but because saying them aloud would make everything real. "Something's been happening," I began, "and I need to understand what my options are." He nodded, inviting me to continue. So I told him. Not every emotion, those I kept tucked behind my ribs, but the facts, steady and chronological. The fall, the clean break in the railing, the missing documents, the attempted access to my bank account. His expression didn't shift toward disbelief or impatience. If anything, he leaned a little closer, as though drawing the truth out of the spaces between my sentences. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "Ms. Cole, this is serious." I nodded. "Yes, I suspected as much." He opened a folder on his desk. "You mentioned property documents. Was it your deed that went missing?" "Yes." "Was your signature required for anything recently? Any refinancing, transfers, or title adjustments?" "No." "And you haven't granted power of attorney to anyone?" "Absolutely not." He tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "Then someone may be attempting to position themselves to make decisions about your assets. Often, this begins with collecting documents and personal information. Sometimes it escalates to structural tampering if someone wants to create a scenario where a person appears fragile or incapable. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. You mean to make me look incompetent? In some cases, he said gently, yes. Or to hasten a change in living arrangements. Assisted facilities, for example, where control shifts quickly. My stomach tightened. I thought of the way Lorna had said, "You shouldn't handle finances alone anymore." The way Mark hovered near my porch last night, hands in his pockets, too calm for a man watching his mother-in-law fall. "What can I do?" I asked. "First, we protect you. I recommend securing your financial accounts, which you've already begun. Next, we document everything. And finally," he paused, choosing his words with deliberate care, "we file a formal alert with Adult Protective Services. Not an accusation, a safeguard." I felt a sting behind my eyes, but refused to let the tears come. "I never thought it would come to this." "No one does," he said softly. "But you're doing the right thing." He helped me fill out the forms. His questions were respectful, his tone calm. Not once did he make me feel foolish or dramatic. When we finished, he handed me copies in a neat envelope. "One more thing, Ms. Cole," he added. "I suggest changing the locks on your home, today, if possible." The idea startled me. My house had always been a place I trusted, old, worn, but loyal. "Do you think they might come back?" "I think someone already has," he replied. I left the office with the envelope pressed against my chest. Outside, the afternoon light was cool and steady, the kind that reveals more than it hides. I walked slowly, each step carrying the weight of a truth I could no longer soften. People talk about getting older as though it means fading. But in that moment, I felt more visible than I had in years. The world had sharpened, not blurred. I wasn't afraid of the investigation. I was afraid of what it would confirm. The officers returned 2 days later, just after noon. I heard their voices before I saw them. Low, steady, professional. The kind of tone people use when they already know more than they say. I opened the door slowly, bracing myself on the good railing, wondering what their faces would reveal. Officer Reyes gave me a small nod, her expression gentler than before. The older officer, Hammond, carried a clipboard and a small evidence bag. They looked as if they'd come not just to ask questions, but to deliver answers. Answers I wasn't entirely ready to receive. "Ms. Cole," Reyes said softly, "may we come in?" Of course they could. The house felt different with them inside, as though its old rooms were exhaling after holding their breath too long. They stood in the living room, their eyes scanning, not rudely, but with the awareness of people who understand how danger sometimes hides in ordinary spaces. "We've completed our preliminary assessment of your porch," Hammond began. The cut in the railing was deliberate. Tool marks indicate it was made with a fine-tooth saw. A saw. My stomach tightened, though the truth was no surprise. My eyes drifted to the window, to the familiar outline of the porch where I had fallen. It looked so harmless under the afternoon light, as if pretending nothing had happened. "Do you know anyone," Reyes continued carefully, "who has access to your property and might use such a tool?" My voice felt small, but steady. "My son-in-law keeps his tools in his truck. He's done minor repairs here before." Reyes nodded slowly, not judging, simply gathering pieces. "We also reviewed the neighbor's security footage," she added. That caught my breath. "The neighbors have cameras?" "Only on their driveway. but it captures part of your street. Reyes paused. It recorded someone approaching your porch the afternoon before your fall. The room felt suddenly colder. Who? We're verifying the image, Hammond said, but it appears to be a male, adult, medium build. Mark. The thought came without hesitation, without softness. But I didn't say his name, not yet. I needed the truth to stand on its own legs, not lean on my suspicions. There's something else, Reyes said. Her voice grew quieter, gentler, like someone preparing to deliver bad news without wanting to bruise the listener. She handed me the evidence bag. Inside was a single sheet of paper, my property deed, the original. I stared at it as if it were a ghost. Part of me wanted to believe it had been found somewhere benign, misplaced by mistake. But my drawer had been opened, and the bank had been contacted. My daughter's voice echoed in my mind. You really shouldn't handle finances alone anymore, as if she were practicing a line meant to sound caring while serving another purpose entirely. Where did you find it? I asked. In the trash bin behind your daughter's house, Hammond said. A long silence settled over the room, the kind that builds slowly, like snow falling on branches, until everything bends under its weight. I sat down carefully. My legs felt unreliable. The bandaged wrist pulsed against my lap. I traced the outline of the document through the plastic, feeling its edges like a map leading somewhere I didn't want to go. We're not drawing conclusions yet, Reyes said gently. But the pattern concerns us. The damaged railing, the missing documents, the attempted account access. You were right to contact us. Right. I hadn't been right in a long time, not in the eyes of my family. Hearing it now felt strange, both comforting and painful. We'll be interviewing your daughter and her husband officially, Hammond said. We'll notify you of any developments. Something in me resisted the idea, not because they didn't deserve questioning, but because I knew how easily people like them could twist a story, especially when the other narrator is an aging woman with a sprained wrist and a quiet voice. Will they know I gave you this information? I asked. Not unless it becomes necessary, Reyes replied. Their kindness steadied me. I saw no condescension in their eyes, only professionalism and a kind of protective clarity that made the room feel a shade safer. After they left, I stayed by the window, watching their car pull away. The house felt impossibly still. A faint breeze lifted the curtains, carrying with it the faint smell of the outdoors. Grass, old wood, the winter air creeping in. I thought of Lorna as a child, placing her small hand in mine without hesitation. Of the drawings she once taped to the refrigerator. Of the softness she used to carry before life, or marriage, or something unnamed reshaped her into someone harder. I pressed my hand against the window pane. The glass was cool. The truth wasn't circling around me anymore. It was walking straight toward me, step by step, unhurried and undeniable. And I, for the first time in years, wasn't stepping aside for it. I hadn't meant to call my granddaughter. Truly, I hadn't. There's a kind of pride that settles into your bones with age, a reluctance to burden the young with troubles you believe should remain yours alone. But that evening, as the light dimmed across the living room and the house pressed its silence against me, I found myself dialing her number without thinking. Amelia answered on the second ring. Grandma? Everything okay? Her voice was warm, young, unguarded in the way her mother's voice hadn't been for years. I'm all right, I said, though the words felt fragile. I just... Wanted to hear your voice. There was a pause, soft and thoughtful. Mom said you had a little accident. Are you really okay? Just sore, I replied. More bruised pride than anything else. She laughed gently, but the sound faded quickly. You don't sound like yourself. It's remarkable how children can hear what adults train themselves to ignore. There's been some trouble, I admitted, but I don't want to drag you into it. You don't have to drag me, she said quietly. I'm here. So I told her. Not everything, not the full weight of it, but enough. The fall, the cut railing, the missing documents. The bank call. Her silence grew heavier with each detail. Grandma, she finally whispered, I've noticed things. For a long time. The way Mom talks to you. The way Mark decides things for her. About you. Your house, your money. I didn't want to think it meant anything. You're young, I said softly. You're supposed to think the best of people. Maybe, she replied, but I don't think the best of Mark. I never have. Her words settled over me like a blanket. Warm, painful, comforting. I had spent years trying to excuse things I didn't want to name. But children have a way of naming truths adults only circle around. Did they ever say anything to you? I asked. About me? Another long pause. Not directly, she said. But Mom said once that it was time for you to accept help and stop being stubborn. Mark said you were too trusting with your papers. They talked like you were slowing down. Slowing down. The phrase stung, not because it wasn't partly true, but because of how easily it could become an excuse to take from someone. I felt my throat tighten. Grandma, Amelia continued, her voice firmer now, I don't care what they think. I know you. I know you're not forgetful, and you're not helpless. Thank you, I whispered. It means more than you know. She hesitated before speaking again. Do the police think someone did this on purpose? Yes, I said quietly. They do. Another silence. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with something like anger. If Mom and Mark are involved, I don't know what I'll do. You'll do what you've always done, I said, steadying her the way I once steadied her small hands when she learned to write. You'll stay kind. You'll stay clear. This isn't your burden. But you're my grandmother, she said. I care about you more than anyone. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle into the parts of me that had gone cold over the years. For the first time since the fall, I didn't feel alone. Come by tomorrow, I said softly, if you can. I will, she promised. I'm not letting you go through this by yourself. When we ended the call, the house no longer felt quite so hollow. Someone still stood with me. And sometimes, one heart is enough to steady another. The next morning, I woke with a sense of steadiness I hadn't felt in a long time. Not strength exactly. Strength is a younger woman's word. But clarity. And clarity, at my age, is far more powerful. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It simply settles into the bones and begins to rearrange the world around you. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, watching the steam curl into the sunlight. All the small humiliations of the last years drifted through my mind. The comments about my memory. The pressure to let go of my home. The little sighs of impatience when I didn't agree quickly enough. I had accepted those things the way one accepts a drafty window or a creaking floorboard. Annoyances that become part of the house if you let them. But the fall had changed something. It wasn't just the pain or the laughter. It was the realization that I had spent years adjusting myself to keep the peace, without ever asking whether peace was serving me at all. So I took out a pad of paper and began making a list. I wrote slowly, deliberately, each decision feeling like a knot I was finally untying. First, the monthly transfers to Lorna. They had started small, $20 here, $50 there, little gifts meant to ease her burdens when she was struggling. Somehow, they had become expected, then required. I logged into my account and canceled them. The bank's confirmation message felt strangely comforting, like closing a door that had been left open too long. Second, the emergency credit card I'd given her years ago for unexpected situations. I called the company and removed her access. The representative asked if I wanted to add someone else. I told him no. My voice didn't waver. Third, the spare house key. The one she and Mark had used whenever they pleased. Dropping by when I wasn't home, letting themselves in with the ease of people who assumed my space belonged partly to them. I stood at the front door, key in hand, feeling the weight of all the times I had pretended not to notice their footprints in my routines. I placed the key in a drawer and scheduled a locksmith for the afternoon. Fourth, my will. It had been untouched for years, written back when my family felt intact. I looked at the envelope tucked into my bookshelf and felt a strange calm settle over me. A will isn't punishment. It's a reflection. And reflections can change when the light shifts. Mr. Alden would help me revise it. I would make sure my choices were thoughtful, not emotional. But they would be mine. As I moved through the house, a quiet resolve followed me from room to room. I wasn't angry. Anger is hot and impulsive. It cools too quickly. What I felt now was something steadier, like the slow tightening of a thread pulled back into place. Around noon, Amelia arrived. She didn't knock loudly, just a gentle tap, as if asking the house for permission. When I opened the door, she looked at me with a softness that nearly undid me. "You look different," she said. "Sharper." "Do I?" I smiled. "Maybe I'm just finally awake." We sat together in the living room, the sunlight stretching across her knees. I told her, calmly and plainly, about the steps I'd taken that morning. She listened without interrupting, her eyes growing brighter, not with sadness, but with something like pride. "Good," she said when I finished. "You're protecting yourself." "I should have done it sooner," I murmured. "Maybe," she replied, "but you're doing it now." Her certainty steadied me more than anything had in weeks. Before she left, she squeezed my hand gently, my uninjured one. "Whatever happens next, you're not alone." I watched her walk down the path, her figure small against the afternoon light. For the first time in years, the house felt like it belonged wholly to me again. Not because anything had changed within its walls, but because something had changed within me. And once a woman stops being convenient, she becomes something far more powerful, herself. Lorna arrived just after sunset, the way people do when they hope the darkness will make the visit seem softer, less deliberate. I saw her through the window before she knocked, pacing once, smoothing her hair, squaring her shoulders. Preparing, not for an apology. No, my daughter has never rehearsed apologies. She rehearses control. I opened the door before she could summon the courage to knock. She stepped inside quickly, as if afraid I might change my mind about letting her in. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk." I nodded and led her to the living room. She didn't sit until I did. A small detail, but telling. Her eyes swept the room, pausing on the new lockbox on the table where I'd placed some documents earlier. I saw the flicker in her expression, faint, wary, before she smoothed it over. I heard you went to a lawyer, she began, her tone light but forced, and that you've been making changes. I have, I said. A beat. Then she inhaled sharply through her nose. Mom, don't you think that's a little dramatic? You could have talked to me first. I've tried talking for years, I replied. My voice wasn't raised, yet it seemed to fill the room in a way hers didn't. She crossed her arms, a defensive gesture she learned from Mark. You canceled the transfers, the card, you changed the locks. Do you know how that looks? Yes, I said. It looks like I'm protecting myself. Her mouth tightened. From your own family? I looked at her for a long moment, really looked. The stiffness in her jaw, the impatience in her eyes, the way she leaned forward, not out of concern, but calculation, like someone preparing a negotiation they assumed they would win. Lorna, I said quietly. Someone cut my railing. Her face went still, too still. And someone entered my home without my knowledge. Someone took my deed. Someone tried to access my bank account. She didn't deny it. She didn't even gasp. She simply blinked slowly, as if buying time for her thoughts to rearrange themselves. Mom, she finally said, you're confused. You've been under stress. Accidents happen, documents get misplaced, and banks make mistakes all the time. It was the gentlest gaslighting she had ever attempted, coded in a daughter's concern, shaped to resemble love. But there was something brittle beneath it, something fearful. I'm not confused, I replied, and the police aren't confused either. That pierced her composure. I saw it. The sudden flicker of alarm quickly pressed down. You talked to them? She asked, too quickly. They came to me, I said. They found the deed in your trash. She looked away, her throat tightening. Mark takes out the trash, she said, as if that clarified anything. And he has all kinds of papers in there. You know how he is. Yes, I said softly. I do. Her mask slipped, just enough for something sharper to show beneath. You shouldn't be involving outsiders, she said. It's family business. It doesn't need to become bigger. Bigger? I repeated. Like an investigation? Her silence answered for her. For the first time in years, I didn't shrink inside myself. I didn't rush to soften things or soothe her discomfort. I simply sat still, letting the truth stand between us. Mom, she said finally, her voice trembling around its edges. Please don't make things worse. I folded my hands, one bandaged, one steady, and looked at my daughter with a calm she couldn't touch. I'm not making things worse, I said. I'm just not letting things continue. She stared at me, realizing slowly that the version of me she had grown accustomed to, compliant, apologetic, eager to smooth over her sharp edges, was no longer sitting in front of her. The house felt different around us. Wider, stronger. My house. My life. And she seemed suddenly small within it. 3 days passed before the police called again. I had expected the ring, yet when it came, it still startled me. There is something about an official call that tightens the air around you, even when you think you are prepared. Officer Reyes asked if she and Hammond could stop by. Her tone held no urgency, but also no softness. It was the voice of someone carrying facts. When they arrived, I invited them into the kitchen. The afternoon light made long rectangles on the floor, and the kettle whistled gently behind me. Somehow, the ordinariness of it all felt like a small anchor. Ms. Cole, Hammond began. "We've completed our interviews with your daughter and her husband." He paused, giving me a chance to brace myself. Their accounts raised some concerns. Reyes opened a folder. Paper rustled, a simple sound, but heavy in moments like this. "First," she said, "Mark admitted he was on your porch the day before your fall. He claimed he came to drop off a ladder he borrowed months ago." I let out a slow breath. A ladder. A tidy little explanation, smooth as polished stone. "He didn't mention this during our initial questioning," she added. Of course he hadn't. Mark never offers information unless pressed. "Second," Hammond said, "his fingerprints were found on the cut section of the railing." My fingers tightened around my mug, not in shock, more in confirmation, like finally hearing out loud what my bones already knew. "He said," Reyes continued, "that he touched the railing after you fell when checking for damage. But the prints were underneath the break," Hammond added quietly, "on the inner surface." I felt something inside me settle. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just a sad kind of certainty. When truth arrives, it rarely feels victorious. It feels inevitable. "There's more," Reyes said. "We obtained a warrant to look at Mark's financial activity. He searched for information about property transfers and accelerated home sales in the days before your fall." My heart tightened. I thought of the missing deed, the bank call, the laughter. "And," she added, "he also searched how to determine mental competency of an elder family member." That one hit hardest. Not because I believed any of it, but because I saw the shape of their intentions. The future they were building for me. Without my voice, without my consent. Hammond looked at me with steady eyes. "Ms. Cole, we believe there is enough evidence to proceed with charges related to attempted financial exploitation and reckless endangerment." Attempted. Such a small word for something that could have cost me my life. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "What happens now?" "We'll be forwarding everything to the district attorney," Reyes said. "You may be asked to give a fuller statement. We'll keep you updated." I thanked them, though gratitude was an inadequate word for what I felt. Not relief. I wasn't relieved. The truth has weight, even when you want it. It sits on your chest in a new shape, and you must learn how to breathe around it. After they left, I stood by the porch window again. The broken railing had been removed. Temporary boards replaced it. But in my mind, I could see the fall. Not my body hitting the steps. I barely remembered that anymore. What stayed with me was their laughter, the way they stood above me, unbothered, almost amused. Some wounds don't bruise the skin. They bruise the years. I leaned my hand against the glass, feeling its cool steadiness. The investigation had passed its turning point. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. And proof, I was learning, can be both a burden and a freedom. The district attorney's office asked me to come in for a meeting the following week. They weren't ready to call it a hearing, not yet, but the tone of the letter made it clear that things had moved firmly beyond concerns. I arrived early, as I always do, sitting quietly in the hallway outside a room full of voices I couldn't yet hear. When they finally called me in, Lorna and Mark were already seated at the far end of the table. Seeing them there, not in my living room, not on my porch, but in a cold municipal conference room, felt like looking at strangers wearing familiar skin. Lorna's face was drawn tight, her fingers twisting a tissue she hadn't used. Mark looked as he always did, composed, polite, a man convinced he could talk his way out of anything. I sat opposite them, my hands folded neatly on the table. The officers were present. A young assistant district attorney led the questioning. "Mrs. Cole," she began, "thank you for coming. We're here to clarify a few points as part of our investigation. You may hear statements from your daughter and son-in-law, but you are not required to respond unless asked directly." It was strange, being protected from my own family. Strange, and yet steadying. The ADA turned to Mark first. "Mr. Benton, during our search of your home, your fingerprints were found on the underside of the damaged railing. Can you explain how they got there?" Mark cleared his throat, offering a small, agreeable smile. "As I told the officers, I inspected the railing after the fall. I must have touched underneath without realizing." Hammond leaned forward slightly. "These prints were beneath the cut, on a surface impossible to reach without sawing through first." Mark's smile thinned. "Then the prints must not be mine." "We verified them twice," Reyes said calmly. A long, brittle silence followed. "Additionally," the ADA continued, "your internet search history shows repeated queries regarding rapid property transfer of a relative, as well as steps for declaring diminished mental capacity. Do you deny making those searches?" Mark's jaw moved. A muscle twitched. "People look up all kinds of things. It doesn't mean—" "It does when your mother-in-law's deed is found in your trash," Reyes said. Lorna flinched at that. Her eyes darted to him, then back to the table. It was the first time she looked uncertain in a way that reached her bones. The ADA turned to her. "Ms. Benton, did you know the deed was in your household trash?" Lorna hesitated. Not the hesitation of confusion, but of calculation, of someone weighing which version of the truth might hurt them less. I didn't know," she said finally. Her voice was small, unsteady. "Mark handles the bills. I assumed—" "You assumed what?" The ADA pressed gently. Lorna's eyes flicked toward me. Something passed through her expression. Guilt, fear, or perhaps the realization that the scaffolding she'd leaned on for years had begun to collapse. "That he knew what he was doing," she whispered. The room went very still. I watched the two of them, my daughter and the man she'd chosen, sitting side by side yet drifting apart with each question. Their confidence had drained, replaced by something sharper, more desperate. It wasn't anger I felt while watching them, not even betrayal, just a deep, steady sadness for what they had allowed themselves to become. The ADA closed her folder. "We will be moving forward with formal charges." Mark exhaled sharply, the sound brittle. Lorna lowered her head. I did not gloat. I did not look away. I simply breathed. The slow, full breath of someone finally standing in the open after years of shadows. As we left the room, their eyes followed me. Not with amusement, not with dismissal, not with that practiced impatience I'd learned to endure. No. For the first time in a very long time, they looked at me with fear. The hearing itself was brief, almost disappointingly so. After weeks of slow-moving truth, of questions and statements and small revelations that struck with the weight of falling stones, the courtroom felt strangely hollow. The judge listened, nodded, made notes. The attorneys spoke in calm, controlled voices, and I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling neither victorious nor defeated, simply awake. Mark stood beside his attorney, shifting constantly, as if the floor beneath him refused to settle. Lorna sat a step behind him, pale and trembling. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically, No, the shrinking was somewhere deeper, in the way she held herself, the way she couldn't bring herself to lift her gaze to mine. The charges were read: attempted financial exploitation, reckless endangerment, unlawful tampering with property. Hearing the words spoken aloud felt almost surreal. They didn't echo. They didn't sting. They simply existed, solid and unarguable, like a door finally closing. The judge reviewed the findings: the fingerprints under the cut, the footage, the deed in their trash, the attempted bank access, the search history. With each item, Mark's face tightened, the confident sheen wearing thin until he looked more like a man caught in the center of his own undoing. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. "Mrs. Cole," the judge said, "do you wish to speak before I issue the protective order?" I stood slowly. My bones felt steady beneath me. "Yes, Your Honor." The room quieted. Even Mark stilled. "I am not here for revenge," I said. My voice didn't waver. "And I am not here to punish my daughter or her husband. I am here because I fell down a set of stairs that should have never broken. I am here because someone cut them. I am here because documents went missing from my home. And because I was laughed at when I needed help." My gaze drifted, not accusing, simply remembering. I have lived my life quietly. I never asked for much. But dignity, I added softly, should not be something a woman my age has to defend. A faint tremble passed across Lorna's face. She looked down, her hands knotted together. I saw her inhale sharply, as if bracing for words she could not control. "I do not hate my daughter," I continued, "but I will not excuse what she allowed. I will not excuse what her husband did." Silence settled around us, heavy, respectful. When I sat, the judge nodded once, in a way that felt almost like acknowledgement rather than routine procedure. He granted the protective order. Mark was forbidden from approaching me or my home. Further charges would proceed in their own time. Lorna was not charged, but she was formally instructed to cease all involvement in my affairs, unless invited in writing. The gavel struck once, a sound that ended more than the hearing. As people began to stand, Lorna approached me, hesitant, as if stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "Mom," she whispered, "please, we can fix this." I looked at her, really looked. At the woman she'd become, at the remnants of who she once was, at the distance between the two. "It's not something that broke overnight," I said quietly, "and it won't mend with one apology." Her eyes filled, but I didn't reach for her. Compassion and boundaries can coexist. I was learning that now. Mark didn't speak to me. He didn't look at me. He walked past with the stiff, clipped movements of a man who believed shame was beneath him, yet he carried it anyway. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and clean. I breathed it in slowly. It settled into me the way courage sometimes does, quietly, without ceremony. Nothing had ended. Not really, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long, long while, my life was back in my own hands. The house felt different when I returned from the courthouse, though nothing inside had changed. The same old rug waited by the door. The same bookshelf bowed slightly under the weight of decades. The same kettle sat on the stove where I'd left it that morning. Yet the air felt clearer, as if the house had been holding its breath for years and finally released it. I hung my coat on the hook and stood there a moment, listening. There is a kind of silence that feels empty, and there is a kind that feels earned. This one felt like the latter. I brewed tea slowly, the old familiar motions settling into my bones. My wrist still ached where the sprain lingered, but the ache no longer felt like a reminder of the fall. It felt like a reminder that I had stood up afterward, even when those who should have helped me laughed instead. I carried my tea to the porch. The temporary railing looked plain but sturdy. The breeze touched my face gently, as though greeting me. For the first time since the fall, I sat outside without feeling watched, without feeling unsafe. I thought of Lorna, of the way her shoulders collapsed in the courtroom, the way her eyes avoided mine. A part of me, some old maternal instinct, wanted to reach for her, to soften what had hardened between us. But love cannot mend what truth has shattered, not immediately, and not without willingness on both sides. And she was not ready. Perhaps she never would be. But I no longer felt responsible for the path she had chosen. A mother can guide a child, but she cannot walk their life for them. Not at 5 years old, not at 48. I looked down the street, where Amelia often parked her small car when she visited. She had texted earlier, asking if I wanted company that evening. I told her no. I needed a few hours with myself. She understood. She has a way of listening that doesn't require words. The sun drifted lower, touching the tops of the houses in a soft amber glow. The world outside continued its steady rhythm, a dog barking 2 yards away, a car door slamming, the faint sound of laughter from a house that was not mine. Life went on, and I was still here to meet it. I used to think aging meant shrinking into smaller rooms, smaller expectations, smaller versions of ourselves. But I've learned something else these past weeks. Age can also be an expansion, a widening of clarity, a refusal to be nudged aside simply because others find your dignity inconvenient. I touched the new railing lightly. It was smooth beneath my fingers. My porch would be repaired soon. My accounts were secured. My will was being rewritten carefully, thoughtfully. My days felt more my own than they had in years. Mark would face what he had earned. Lorna, she would have to live with what she allowed. And I, in my quiet corner of the world, had reclaimed the simple truth that had slipped from me over time. A woman does not disappear just because others stop seeing her. I finished my tea as the sun dipped fully behind the trees. The evening settled in, soft and open. Tomorrow I would bake bread. The next day I might volunteer at the library again. Small things, ordinary things, but done freely, on my terms. Freedom at 69 doesn't look like it does at 20. It looks calmer, firmer, a hand that no longer trembles when it reaches for its own life. And if anyone ever laughs at me again, it will not be because I let them. If you've read this far, take a moment for yourself. Honor your dignity, protect your boundaries, and never let anyone decide your worth for you.